Three, two, one. Welcome to the SBH podcast. We have a very special podcast today because we have a guest, Joe Dion from Poombah Plugs. Thank you so much for coming on.
My pleasure, Finn. Thanks.
Yeah, no problem. So, to start the podcast off, I've talked a lot about Poombah Plugs and I've done multiple podcasts on your plugs. And so, really, I guess people want to know, who are you?
Who am I?
Who are you?
I'm just a guy that likes to fish and play around with wood in a wood shop. That's about it. I've been in corporate life my whole life, and but I've fished longer than I've been in corporate life, and fished ever since I can remember, and have always just had an interest in making things out of wood. And the two kind of, fit together. And I still have the first plug I ever made. I think I was 10, so that was about 40 years ago.
Yeah. And when you're making plugs, being able to find inspiration in creating new plugs is difficult to do. And being able to create your plugs, you've created some extraordinary plugs that I've talked about, like the Shad Stick and the Magnum Walkers are two of my favorites. And I had the pleasure to fish with you, and we were able to we were able to fish, and we were able to use those plugs together, and I thought it was pretty awesome to be able to fish with those plugs with you, and hear about about how you created the plugs. But I really wanted to get into when did you start fishing? So how'd you really get into fishing?
I can't remember. I was so young, but had to have been 4, 5, 6 years old, and my dad always took me fishing, and we actually fished with a fly rod with a hook and a sinker and a worm, and and then occasionally we would do the same thing, same setup, only on spinning gear, but never saltwater fished, mostly stream and river fishing for brook trout, brown trout, salmon.
So and where was this exactly?
I grew up in Vermont, so central Vermont. Yeah, and we spent a lot of time in Maine. From about, when I got to be about 10 years old, we started taking trips to northern Maine, up to the Allagash and Caribou Lake, and all through the North Country, West Branch of the Penobscot. So that was a lot of fun. Those were good years. Mm-hmm.
And you started fishing, and when did you start catching striped bass? Or go start focusing more on fishing for striped bass?
Well, the first memory, I didn't even know really much anything about saltwater fishing. And we had a place in Chatham every summer. So I grew up my summers on the Cape, and all we did was clam. And I remember one year we went crabbing, and we never went fishing. This is back in the 70s. And I remember that I was about 15, and I took a trip with my best friend and his 2 older brothers and his mom and dad, and we went down to Cape Cod and rented a place. And at night, the 2 brothers came back. They were, I think, 5 or 8 years older than us. And the 2 brothers came back, and one of them had a striped bass that was just the biggest fish I think I'd ever seen. And I was just fascinated that they caught it at night, and they had all kinds of stories about wading out for a mile and getting bit by crabs and fighting off the crabs, and then, they landed this monstrous fish at night. So I was just enthralled with that. Still never, that just lasted in my memory forever. And still never had much exposure to fishing saltwater until I worked for the Orvis Company back in the 90s. And saltwater fly fishing was kind of in vogue at that time, and really coming of age. and we had consultants working with us. One of them was Lou Tabery out of Connecticut. He's kind of considered one of the deans of striped bass fly fishing early on. And got my introduction to Cooper Giltz out on Martha's Vineyard, and just loved the vineyard so much, and fishing for bluefish and striped bass, that we started going there multiple times a summer, and kind of never looked back after that. That was those were some of the best years of my life. You know, being a single guy, no obligations at home, just could cut loose with my buddies. It was a lot of fun.
Yeah, it's a lot like me right now, you know, just getting after it, you know, all by myself with no real like responsibilities. So I have so much extra time, you know, to be fishing. So, I mean, that's definitely like so similar to like as far as me and my fishing, and being able to just spend lots of time just, you know, exploring the water and learning so much from just being out there constantly. But I'm pretty curious about like, so what did you do exactly for Orvis?
I was called a product development specialist for their fishing and hunting catalog. So basically, we did market research. We invented things if we could invent things, and bring them to the market. And so you really had to be exposed at all times. You had to have a great network, and lots of connections. And you know, and then once we identified those products, you know, they went into the catalog. So there was a whole published printing catalog schedule that you were, you know, dead drop dates, and so yeah, it was. I met some fantastic people. I've met some of the greatest outdoorsmen that I've ever known to this day with that company. It's an outstanding company. Yeah.
And did you do a lot of fly fishing when you're on the Cape for striped bass?
That's all we did back in those days. Like,
Really?
for any of us to pick up a spinning rod was taboo. We didn't work. We really worked for a fly fishing company.
Really?
Yeah, and we were into it. I mean, it was a lot of fun. We you know, we had some nights that were just tremendous nights out there on the vineyard.
Was that more off like the rocks or sandy beaches were you fishing?
Didn't we fished a lot of sandy beaches? Sometimes pebbly a little bit. You know, there's a few famous spots out there that people know about. One of the best nights I ever had was in the rocks. It's all changed because of hurricanes now, but yeah, the southwest shore is a place called Squid Dock, and Squid Dock was actually, it was one of the first times I picked up. I snuck out. All the guys had gone to bed because we'd been fishing for a few days, and I snuck out with a surf rod instead of the fly rod, and that was my first night I ever fished Danny plugs. And now I see why Danny plugs are so well known, because I hauled some big fish out of those rocks that night. I was all by myself. It was a calm night, no wind, and just the moon was really bright. It was pretty magical. But
Did you transition at that point?
sorry?
From fishing more like fly to spinning, or did you just stick with fly after that?
Oh no, we stuck with fly for many years. You know, all during my tenure in the mid '90s to the end of the '90s, I pretty much fly fished only. It wasn't till I don't know, maybe 10 years later that I really started spin fishing, mostly because I wanted to, you know, make plugs and catch fish on the plugs that I was making.
Yeah. And did that start after you stopped fishing? Where did you go from fishing like with flies and then transition to like making plugs instead of like making flies and tying flies and stuff?
Well, I still do both. I mean, I still fly fish and I still tie my own flies. You know, I spend the majority of the time doing plugs now. And you know, part of the satisfaction, it's the same with tying flies, is catching a fish on something you tied and you imitated nature. It's a pretty special feeling if you do it yourself. So now I have to get that feeling kind of vicariously through my customers. So I'll make a plug, and then they share the fact that they caught a fish, and not quite as much, but I almost feel as good as when I catch the fish myself. But
Yeah, I was gonna say, how do you feel when you're seeing the people like using your plugs now and catching all these tremendous fish on them?
It's pretty crazy.
It,
How many?
it's a huge ego booster, because it really validates, you know, what I'm doing. So to people, when people say, you know, your plugs really work, you know, they're so beautiful, and I tend to be my hardest critic. Like, I've yet to make the perfect plug. You know, I probably never will. I've made some good looking plugs, but I'll never make the perfect plug. And you know, to hear people say they're happy with what I've done, it really just is self validating, and it feels really good.
Yeah.
It's awesome, you know, to be able to see the craftsmanship that goes into the plugs, because a lot of wooden plugs, I mean, everything down to like the painting and everything on it is super well made. And I've like some of the more realistic plugs that I fish with, I mean, it's pretty hard to find like a plug that's painted to imitate bunker as well as your plugs do. And you do that, like, I think one of the things that you do so well is have these very realistic colors on your plugs. Is there a trick to being able to paint the plug so realistically?
Not really. I appreciate you saying that. I mean, I think there's some artists. I'm not really an artist. There's some guys out there that are truly able to manipulate an airbrush, you know, really well. I can't really do that from a volume perspective. I'm not using a little airbrush. I mean, I'm using automotive sprayers for the most part. But, you know, I use templates wherever you can, so you've got consistency and you've got a nice looking pattern. And I've worked a lot on different templates. You know, it's got to be, at the end of the day, it's got to be pleasing to the human eye. You know, to make it off the shelves. And then if you want them to buy another lure, it has to have some luck with it, so it's got to be pleasing to the fish's eye. But
And when you're creating these plugs, you're talking about how Danny plugs are your favorite plugs. Did you start making Danny plugs first? What was the first plug you really started to build?
the first plug was probably a pencil popper. Danny's are the hardest plug to make. Pencil poppers are pretty easy. You know, they float, and they're not made that, I mean, you could just kind of pump the rod and twitch the rod, and any plug that floats that's a long stick-like thing is going to have plenty of action. I mean, people will argue that I say that, but those are the easiest ones to turn on the lathe, and they're the most forgiving, I would say. There's other plugs, particularly plugs that are subsurface. They're a lot harder to make.
Yeah, and I wanted to. The pencils that you create. I fished with a lot of different like custom pencils, and I do have to say, as far as like, them being like your plugs are very easy. Especially your pencils are extremely easy to work as far as pencils go. I found a lot of the time when you're buying a plug or you're fishing with other custom plugs, they're super heavy sometimes. They're very hard to work. You got to be like very proficient working a pencil to even get the pencil to work. And I love how your plugs work very well in general, because the pencils work so well on the surface. They're super easy to tear up the surface, which you don't see with lots of plugs. I mean, it's pretty rare, in my opinion, that you get a plug that is like perfect, very easy when you get them right out of the package to just get them working nice on the surface. And the other question I had for you is, I've talked with a lot of different people, and this is pretty controversial, but do you fish pencil poppers at night, or poppers in general at night?
I have. Yep. And I've had luck.
You've had luck on them?
Oh, yeah. Yeah. I've caught some big fish on floating plugs. Now you can fish a pencil popper and you don't have to rip it at night. I mean, you can if you want, but you know, striped bass feed more at night than any other time because they see in a different light spectrum. But you know, bait fish don't go to sleep, and they're still scared to death. And those bait fish are still up. They're still getting chased. They're still on the surface. I don't know if it would be my first plug of choice at night, but I've had plenty of luck. I've had plenty of luck with the spook style or the Magnum walkers at night, both bluefish and stripers.
And that's pretty interesting because, you know, I've talked to people that say, oh, I'll never throw a pencil or a spook at night. And, you know, as far as like, as my fishing goes, I feel like, Danny plugs, at least a good majority of them are up on the surface. And they are slower moving. So I guess that maybe is one of those things where the bass are able to really key in on the plug. But people say that the pencil popper is just so like erratic, the motion on the surface, that the bass can't really tell how big it is or what it is, so they don't really like go after it. But as far as like the Magnum Walker, I feel like that would make so much sense for a bigger fish to see that slowly like working on the surface and then want to come in and hit it. Like in so many people say, yeah, never fish topwaters at night. I just wanted to see what you were thinking as far as like fishing topwaters at night.
I think under the right circumstances, if you're not fishing a topwater like a spook style or Danny plug at night, then you're missing the boat entirely, and you're missing a lot of fish.
Yeah.
But,
Oh yeah.
yeah, I mean, there's something to be said about that kind of action, I guess, at night. But like I said, striped bass in particular, see in a different light spectrum, so they have pretty good visibility at night. And they can see those things, and they can, they've got a strong lateral line. They can tell, they can sense the size and how big from the sound that the plug is making. They get a sense of the size of it.
Another question that's been asked pretty frequently and is like, what's the process of like making a plug? Is there like a set process that you go through when you're making the plugs?
Well, yeah, I mean, there's probably like 40 something steps to making a plug. A lot of them have something in common, but essentially, you have to choose the right wood, and the right wood is going to be based on the design and what you want the plug to do. So you choose your wood, and then you basically cut the blank down to size. Now, I don't turn everything on a lathe. Sometimes I cut on a bandsaw, and I have a router, and I have a drum sander. But so then you have to shape the plug. Once it's shaped, you've got to do the various drilling operations for eyes and hooks and swivels and whatnot. Then you've got to sand it. And so you wanna get a pretty good smooth finish on it. Then you've got to seal it, and so the sealing act actually penetrates the pores, the fibers of the wood. And what the sealing is it's not just a topical application, because it's penetrating the wood. That'll be much more effective on propelling water. And so the wood, you don't want the wood plug to absorb water whatsoever.
Yeah.
So sealing's a really important step, and there's a lot of ways to do it. After the sealing, I do like a top coat, which is an extra layer for protection, but it also lays the foundation where I can sand it pretty smooth for the paint. So then you have to paint. So there's a priming coat, and then there's generally your whatever colors that you want. And then after that, I apply a spray-on sealer, which helps protect the paint from when I'm handling it. Then I'll assemble the plug totally with all the wire hardware and put the eyes on. And once it's totally assembled, then I'll put a couple layers of epoxy on it.
What is the difference, or how important is is the different types of wood that you use?
Oh, it's really important. I mean, it depends on how high you want the plug to float in the water column. I mean, like a Danny, for example, generally I'll make Danny's out of cedar. Cedar's a very lightweight wood, but because a Danny's got a lip, it wants to go under. So you need to kind of counteract that. You really want to fish that Danny where it's rolling and just waking and disturbing the surface of the water. Some guys fish Danny subsurface and that's fine, but most people are in a lot of cases, you'll fish a Danny on top. So you want a lightweight wood. A pencil popper, you can get away with the densest wood you can find because you're reeling so fast, and it's got a sloped face. It's going to come up to the surface real quick and stay on that surface and go back and forth. So pencil poppers, generally people love distance with pencil poppers, right? So denser the wood, the better, because you got a heavier lure with a smaller profile. I make a lot of poppers out of heavy wood. And then other woods I want kind of in between. Something that's like my Magnum Walker, for example, is not really it's not really a dense hardwood. It's a lightweight hardwood. But I don't want cedar because I want casting distance with it. But because of its size, it's got enough buoyancy to stay up.
Yeah. And you want, and I mean, with your plugs, finding the right wood, I mean, for like a pencil popper to be able to have that casting distance, which is so important to get it out and cover as much water as possible, and then still having the ability to have it float correctly and work easily on the surface, seems like such an art. Is there how many like trials did you have to go through before you found like the right wood and the right weighting of the plugs or of the pencil?
We've gone through a lot of trials. I think, one of the reasons why my pencils work so well is because of the weighting system I use. So a lot of people will use lead weight, and when they use a lead weight, the lead becomes a little bit longer, and it goes in the rear, usually in the tail of the plug. Well, when it's that long, you're starting to move the weight towards the center of the plug or farther up towards the nose. So I don't use any lead in any of my plugs. I use all tungsten sleeves. So I have them custom made for me. They're better for the environment. They're better for humans who make them because you're not melting lead. There's no noxious fumes. But the tungsten's so heavy and so dense, I actually end up having the correct amount of weight, but it's more towards the tail of the plug. So when you have that weight in the tail, that nose tends to rip around real easy. That weight wants to stay where it is, and the nose of the plug goes back and forth. When you move that weight forward, you don't get quite as much of that. So I think that's why my pencils work so easily. The Big Eye in particular is because it's got such a wide cup in the front. So that's one of and it's short, and that's one of the reasons why that particular one. So, yeah, I mean, design has a lot to it. Where's the weight placement? Where's the belly hook placement? The overall shape, the wood. Design is the hardest part about plug making. Once you got a good design, it's easy to turn them out and finish them, and it's just repeat steps.
Mm-hmm. And what I think is very unique to your plugs is the nose of a lot of your plugs are very special and pretty unique. Your Magnum Walkers have a cut, at that angle in the front of the nose, which I've noticed in fishing a lot of different types of spooks where you're trying to work the plug and it will dive under the water, and which is very frustrating. But with your Magnum Walker, with the way that you cut the slice into the nose or the angle that it's at, it doesn't end up diving under the water. It kind of just shoots it across the side. So when you're, I've had times where I was fishing with other plugs and there was a big fish following my spook, and I was ripping it, and I got excited because I saw this giant fish waking and boiling on my plug, and I was ripping it and I messed up, and the plug dives under the water, and then the fish doesn't, hit it where you cut a lot of that out with having those very interesting like cuts on the Magnum Walker. And then with the Mac Daddy pencil, you have a very unique cut in the nose of that, which will throw more water. Was there any when you were making and designing the plugs? What did you think when you're designing like the Magnum Walker when you're cutting it at that angle? Was that like in mind?
Well, not the first iteration. So the first iteration was no cut on the nose, and was actually weighted in the center of the belly, more or less. And so the first trial with that, we got the GoPro out, and I had my friend Paul was casting, and he was bringing in the lure, beside me, and I'm filming it, and the lure was just biting into the sand. So it was a really bad design from what I wanted. So I just had to think, what do I need here? So I took the plug and I said, well, if it had almost like a lip, like a pencil, but I don't want to scoop it out, but if it had a sloped lip, that would kind of hydrodynamically push that nose up. And then if I move the weight in the tail, just like the pencil, the plug will actually sitting in the water, just cants upward a little bit, or tail downward, however you prefer to call it. And so now you've got it already facing up, and so when you pull it, between the tail weights and that lip, that solved the problem. So that was an easy one, but the first iteration was a total dud.
Mm-hmm. And when you were, because that cut in like the Big Eye, and the Mac Daddy, was there a reason why you made it that shape as well? Was that to like move more water?
Well, I didn't invent that. I mean, lots of plugs have that. I mean, the old Gibbs plugs, they have a scooped out nose, and so it's pretty much the same. I mean, I don't really make a pencil any much different, other than it uses tungsten weights, and the weight's a little bit toward the back. But there's a lot of good makers out there of pencil poppers, so it's not really a unique design.
Yeah. And I mean, that's the thing. I mean, being in such a like saturated like business, I guess there's just so many plugs, and so many people make plugs, and making plugs different is difficult. And one of the things that you do that nobody else does is you're trying to make your plugs as environmentally friendly as possible. And this is like the big thing with your company that like nobody else is doing. When you started to make plugs, was this from the start where you wanted to make as environmentally friendly plugs as possible?
It wasn't a fully formed out part of the business plan, let's say, but it was very early on that you have to think, how am I going to differentiate myself from the other guys? And let's face it, I mean, I've got a couple unique designs, but I'm really not doing anything new that hasn't been done in the last 100 years, right? So I really thought, what does the market want? What should the market have? And there's a little bit of a scenario there. So the market's not really demanding environmentally friendly plugs, right? But I think manufacturers have to force it on the market. We just have to do it. It's absolutely necessary. Plastic is killing us. It's in the fish we eat today. There's going to be more plastic than fish in the pieces of plastic than fish in the ocean by 2050. So wanting to do the right thing kind of led into, well, I can't believe nobody else is doing this. So you walk into a tackle shop, and all these things are in plastic packaging. So rule number one is, I said, I will never use single-use plastic in any of my product. And I mean, let's face it, my product has plastic in it. Paint itself is a plastic. Epoxy is a plastic. But what I'm doing is using, as much as possible, the most environmentally friendly epoxy. Actually, my epoxy is made from plant matter to a high percentage. I think about the highest in the industry. So it still has some oil base in it, but less than otherwise. My sealer is a bio-based, All my paints and sealers are very, very low VOC, those volatile organic compounds. That's what you smell when you paint.
Yeah.
I got to edit that. I should have had some water.
I know. Hey, if you want to go grab water, no problem. Yeah, go. Yeah, no problem. Just go grab some water. And I'll just keep talking as we do it. So, we're continuing. The cool thing about podcasts in general is the not needing necessarily breaks in podcasts. I've been fortunate enough to work with this company, and as you can see, Joe's so it's so important to him having these the plugs and everything to be as perfect as they can, and he's worked so hard to get these plugs to be as perfect as he can get them. And he was talking about how he doesn't think like he's never creating a good enough plug or a perfect plug, and that's something that's really cool and unique, is that like somebody at their craft, you know that they're trying their best to get better and improve when you don't think of it as ever being perfect. And that's really cool because that's something that I think myself. I never think I've learned everything, because you can never learn enough in fishing. So yeah. And we're back, I guess.
We're back. Yeah, here's the other example of, you buy a plug today, and you always see those little plastic hook protectors over the tips of the hook. Well, I invested in paper, small diameter little paper tubes, and they do just as good a job. And these you could leave right on put your plug on your rod, cast in the water. They'll just fall off at some point, but they're not going to harm the environment. So my plugs go into the store on a hemp string and a paper card.
And that's so cool and unique that like every little detail that you've thought about that other companies are using plastic for, you've switched. You've made the boxes are out of paper or cardboard, I guess. I don't know if it's like a paper cardboard. And then the hook protectors are made out of your paper straws. I mean, that's so cool and unique. And I was reading a thing, and it was like an article saying that the Atlantic menhaden, or bunker pogies, whatever you want to call them, are depleting in population because they're a filter feeding bait fish, and they're one of the biggest bait fish, or I guess the biggest food, or one of the biggest food sources for the striped bass. And if you think about it, them being a filter feeder, they're just ingesting so much microplastics, and it's really hurting the population with all these single-use plastics out there. I mean, that's one of those things that makes this, even like your plugs are so, they're well built, but they're also being able to create a plug that's not only really well built, but also is so unique in the fact that it is helping the environment even in a little way, and giving back to the ocean itself. Because we take so much. I guess we don't take, but we enjoy the ocean so much, the fish in it and just being around it. I mean, it's awesome to be able to, give back to the ocean in whatever little way you can.
Yeah, 100%, Finn. I mean, it's a privilege for us to be able to enjoy that resource, and it's a privilege to give back. I mean, you're right about the menhaden. That is the primary forage species for the striped bass. The menhaden are declining. Some of it's commercial fishing. There was a big controversy this year. I don't know if you remember reading about it, but it was a Canadian company down in Chesapeake. But yeah, I mean, plastic is more prevalent in the Pacific Ocean, but the Atlantic's not immune to it. And it's coming. It's going to be all over the world's oceans. I was reading an article just about synthetic clothes, and when you do a load of laundry, they estimate about 100,000 pieces of microplastics run out with your wastewater from laundry. So Yeah, the ground will filter some of that, but a lot of that will make its way into our oceans.
Yeah. And I think that's something that people don't really, keep in mind when they're like, going buying groceries or even like buying plugs. That everything that's really coming with the plug is pretty much single-use plastics. The hook protectors, the package that the plug is in, you're just throwing that away. And ultimately, the recycling, or there is no real recycling anymore, is a lot of that is either leaching toxic stuff into the water, which is getting back into the ocean, and a lot of it's ending up in the ocean regardless. And it's impacting our ocean in such a huge way. And me being a younger angler and wanting these bass to, or really the fish to in general, to be around for a long time, it's sad to see that there's not a lot being done even in our small community of fishing. There's not a lot being done in the environmental direction.
Yeah, which is, it's odd because you think that would be maybe one of the first places, right? That, we see the evidence because we're out there, and yeah, I don't know. You're right about recycling. I mean, one thing I know is human beings, we pretty much stink at recycling. We recycle about 9% of the plastic that we produce. And virtually all of the plastic that we've ever produced is still around for the last 100 years, and it'll be here. So those little hook protectors, that's going to be around a couple hundred years, few hundred years, 1,000 years. I mean, it'll just get ground up, and become smaller and smaller particles. But
yeah, I mean, it's sad and unfortunate, and it's true. That's like what's happening right now as far as there's a lot of single-use plastic out there. And it was funny because not like that many years ago, plastic wasn't really that like major part in our like lives. People didn't really used to, there wasn't a lot of like plastic wear out there in general. And it's just in the past, maybe 80, 50 years, something like that, that plastic has really become such a big deal in our society. But as far as like, fishing goes, to your point, it's pretty crazy that people that are so reliant on nature are, so unwilling to, help it. And a lot of people are, but like a lot of companies could make the hard decision to spend more money to make something that is going to help the environment, and they don't. It's pretty extraordinary that a company like your, Poombah Plugs, even though it's not the number one, plug company out there, is making the sacrifice to produce stuff that is, healthy for our environment, which is so cool.
Yeah, I think it's incumbent upon manufacturers to change the game, because unfortunately, I don't think they're going to get the consumer demand for it. So I think they need to take the responsible avenue, take on that role of at least eliminating single-use plastics. And plastic's an awful good packaging material, there's no doubt.
Yeah.
But it's a horrible waste material. Single-use plastic becomes waste pretty quickly, right? As soon as you unpackage. So, I'd love to see some other. I don't care about competition. I would be tickled pink and thrilled if other manufacturers were gonna claim to be the world's most eco-friendly plug, manufacturer, or knocked me off, so to speak. That's my goal, is to change the industry. It's not. It's not to make a killing selling plugs. That's a hard way to make a living.
Yeah. And that's something that is so, like, that just shows what kind of a person you are, that you're so, for the environment and what this means to you. The fact that you don't really care about, other companies competing with you. You just want to help change the community. And that's what we are. There's so much, like, I guess, negativity through different companies, especially plug companies, towards each other, when, if like everybody could, take a step back and see, like, we might not have fish in, 30, 40, 50 years from now. We might not have the striped bass around. And so to be able to, maybe save the striped bass or save other species, and not just only within plug company, but within plugs, but within other products, and hopefully it expands further than just like plugs and fishing gear and into other commodities, I guess, that people buy.
Yeah, I mean, the way I look at it is, you can, I won't get into commercial versus recreational fishing and harvesting versus fish farm versus wild stock. Those can be, as society, we can come to terms with that and solve those issues. What we're not going to solve is a bad environment. If you don't have a healthy environment to sustain any kind of fish, then we're all out of luck. So, got to have good habitat.
Mm-hmm. I mean, yeah, and that's super, super important. And to be able to be fortunate enough to fish places like Cape Cod and Rhode Island, and even down here in Cape Ann. And a question that I have for you is, you fished all over the place, especially for striped bass. Even you fished a lot of the coast. Where's your favorite place to fish?
Ooh, hold on one second. I gotta turn off. Can you hear that?
Yeah, a little bit. It's fine. Don't worry about it.
Turn that off before. My favorite place to fish?
Yeah.
Oh, it would be Martha's Vineyard, without a doubt. I mean, I've had some great times in Maine, and I've fished all over this country: California, the Rocky Mountains, Florida, Gulf Coast. Haven't fished Alaska, but out of those places I have fished, Martha's Vineyard is...
Whoa.
Wind fin. I'm in the shop, if you couldn't tell.
Yeah, I know.
Martha's Vineyard is a pretty magical place.
Mm-hmm. Is it the landscape, or is it just the fishing there?
I think at this point, it's memories. There's so many good memories that I have of there, of friends. And, I've been fishing Martha's Vineyard now for at least 25 years. Martha's Vineyard to me means fishing. I've yet to have a drink on the island. I've never even had a beer in that many years.
Yeah.
Because I'm just so anxious to get fishing. A beer would get in the way. Yeah, I mean, a lot of it's got to do with Cooper Gilks and my buddy Paul Fearson and Matt Glarum and everybody out on the island. And I'm making new friends, Janet Massinio, and it's a pretty special, beautiful place.
Is that where you've caught had your best fishing in general, or is did you catch your biggest fish there?
I'm trying to think. No, I've caught some pretty big fish off the Cape.
What's the biggest fish you've caught? Biggest striped bass?
52 inches.
Was that on a fly or spinning?
On a plug.
What's the biggest one you got on a fly rod?
Probably 40, I think somewhere around like 43 inches. Not that big.
43 inches. That's still a really quality fish. That's probably 25 pounds, maybe even 30.
On a 9-weight. That's a lot of fun on a 9-weight. I mean...
Yeah.
That's crazy. Yeah, I mean, I've not done a lot of fly fishing. I want to get into it more next year. You're going to have to help me because you're so I taught myself everything about fly fishing and barely cast. but I would love to fish more at the Fly, and you were fortunate enough to actually come up to Cape Ann and fish, in some of my, honey holes this year. And I actually had probably two of my best nights fishing in general with you. And I thought that was, it was funny. I guess it was good to take the boss out and get him on the fish.
Did your job. Did good, son.
That was hilarious.
Yeah, you're gonna have your hands full if you hook one of those fish with a fly rod in that kind of structure.
Yeah.
Fish of that size. Yeah.
When you, I remember, like, you first pulled up in your truck to my house, and we were getting set up to go out, and I told you, grab the biggest plugs you have. Do you remember when I said that? And what was your thought when I asked you to grab the biggest plugs you had in your box?
What was my thought?
It was funny because I remember you're like, really? Because you pulled out, and I mean, I have one over there, one of those, I think is it double jointed or a triple jointed? I don't know which one it was. It was huge.
So pull down something like that?
Like that. Yeah, exactly. You grabbed those, and we went out, and I put you in this one spot. It's probably, I don't know, probably 15 feet across and between two long stretches of rocks. And the waves crash on one side and they sweep in, and the bass are they sit right in this little it's hard to explain, but for everybody that's listening, but really what it is there's these two rock, more I guess they're just giant little rock, because it's more like a cliff. If you can imagine a cliff going underwater, and it makes this little canal area, and the bass sit in between it. When the water gets pushed from the waves crashing, there's wave sweep, and what happens is the bass are sitting underneath these I guess these little humps under the water, and we killed it. I mean, you threw that. It was first cast you hooked probably a low 30, right? And then the second cast, which you might have shook, I think you spit it right at the rock. And then I remember, because I was standing pretty far away, and then I remember you hooked up again, and you were fighting this fish from the time it took me to walk probably 35 yards across these slippery rocks, because I was on the other side, back in towards you, and we landed, I think it had to be close to 30 pounds, right? It was huge.
Those are some big fish, and I mean the first couple hit 5 feet off the tip of my rod.
Yeah.
But that last one hit much farther out, and I wasn't saving that plug.
No.
He was headed for the next zip code, and wrapped me up on rocks and cut me right off. But yeah, that was fun. That was a fun night.
I was pretty, and then so you came back because you were doing a little tour right up to, or down to what? Did you go to Rhode Island or did you just stay on the Cape?
Massachusetts and Rhode Island, Connecticut, and then came back up through
And when you came back, we had another great night too. Except I think it was more my night than your night that night.
Good night, but they were both good nights. But that's the problem I had. I was supposed to be on the road trying to sell my plugs, and all I was doing was trying to fish every minute I could. But
you can't blame you. Everybody would be doing the same thing. Yeah, because I remember it was funny because we probably caught easily, between the two of us, we probably caught over 10 fish, over 15 pounds.
You were catching them on this, right? The white one?
Yeah. That was killing it. Because it was just getting right down into the rocks, and the bass were just coming up and hammering it. Every single cast, we were getting hits. And then we were about to get, stuck out on the island. I remember we had to, leave before we would get washed away. So that was pretty crazy. That was one of the better nights I think I had. And it's just the fall run. I had probably 4 nights after that were pretty equal, except I think I was eeling at that point, but that I was just catching a lot of those like cookie cutter, like 25, 30-pound fish that we saw so many of that trip.
30-pound cookie cutters.
I guess really. I mean, it's great that we got to experience that this year, and on top of that, it's just the fact of the matter is like the triple jointed swimmer there, and the shad sticks mimic the bunker so well, and especially when they're painted to look exactly like a bunker, and that was just what those big fish were feeding on. They're coming into the rocks, feeding on the bunker, and those plugs are so well, like they're matching the hatch, they're matching the bait so perfectly that the bass were just hammering it. Although I don't think it really mattered at that point. You could throw a hot stove in there and they'd still eat it. I mean,
but there's some other nights though that when they're on bunker and they can be a little bit more selective. And I threw that same trip, but down in southern Mass. I threw a bunch, and I had some hookups, but when I threw a bunker pattern the right size, it was every single cast, and big fish.
it's the thing, that shad stick and the fatty glider just mimic that like medium size bunker perfectly. Like it's that same size and profile that the bass were feeding on, and that's why they just work so well when you have those medium-sized bunker around. And I feel like most areas have that for the majority of the summer. There's big bunker schools around. I know that they had a lot of that down on the Cape, and we had tons. I mean, you'd kayak a little bit offshore. I remember kayaking out and seeing these huge bunker schools with the bunker just jumping out of the water. And being able to like snag the bunker, even though we didn't catch anything that day, but it just shows you how, like, I think the bunker in general have come back a bit, because I was talking to this other local guy, and he was saying that really the fishing is so dependent around here, like how good it's going to be depending on how much bunker are in the area. And because there's so much of it last year around us, we were just killing it all year with these huge fish. And people kept asking me, like, why is the fishing down on Cape Ann so good? And I said, it's probably the bunker schools, because those big fish were just hanging out all year long, just in the rocks all summer.
I find that in the canal with the mackerel. When the mackerel come into the canal, those fish will come in after them, either out of the bay or from the south. But it's all about, bass are survivalists, so they're going to want to get the easiest, biggest meal, the most energy that they can eat, while expending the least amount of energy, right? They don't crash bait just because it's fun, right? They're out there, feeding and surviving. So those big old bunker that are nice and oily and rich in fat, pretty critical.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And the thing is, like, a lot of people are, I wouldn't say scared, but they just are tentative to throw these giant patterns. And I feel like it's been a new trend to throw these bigger, like, patterns, bigger plugs, especially at the canal. A lot of guys have been throwing stuff like the magic swimmers, the like Sabile magic swimmers and whatever, like that type of stuff. And the cool thing is, it's kind of caught on to surf casting outside of the canal, and it's pretty interesting to see now a lot of guys throwing these like giant plugs that they normally wouldn't, outside of the canal, because now people are so much more confident in it, and you see a lot more people catching bigger fish on these big plugs. I think it's something that it's kind of trended or become better, or just more heavily used, these bigger plugs. And then something that I've heard a lot more about recently is these spook style plugs. what is it called, like the little dock or the dock plugs, are like the Magnum Walker, and those, like, not a lot of people used to use them. I think they're a muskie bait, right? People used to use them for muskie. Correct me if I'm wrong.
Docks you can use for muskie, but they make a couple different sizes, and all in white, and they're pretty popular around, Long Island, Block Island, and
Because I heard some people down, or yeah, I mean, I've heard that people down in New Jersey didn't really hear about it. It was more people up in Mass that fished big spook style plugs, and it was because of, or maybe I'm trying to think, but yeah, I'm pretty sure it was that, like, the more northern parts of the striped bass areas were using these plugs because we have these muskie that they don't really have in New Jersey, and the Magnum Walker scene and those big spooks have been so much more prevalent now, and it seems that most guys are carrying them in their bags, and I mean, it's pretty crazy to watch be throwing like pencil poppers in an area and having them not touch the pencil, and then switch over to a spook like a Magnum Walker, and then the bass just, like, you're catching fish one after another. It's interesting that it's just the profile, and maybe that the speed and the action of that plug is similar but a little bit different, and the bass really love that, super slow, like, side to side motion.
yeah, I think you're right. I mean, first of all, a spook style is freshwater or saltwater. My favorite lure to fish. Period.
Yeah.
Second would be a true popper. With a cup face, not a pencil popper, but spook is absolutely my favorite lure, and I'll fish a spook more often than a pencil on the canal. Now, if there's a run that's super hot and heavy on the canal and the tide's really ripping, that gets kind of hard to fish a spook. But especially during the change in the slack tide, I'll fish a spook on the canal a lot, and I've had pretty good luck.
Have you fished the canal way more than I have? I've probably fished it maybe a dozen times, and had one day where I caught, like, the biggest bass of my life, but, like, but still, like, I've had very little luck on the canal, so you can speak way more to the canal than I can, as far as the fishing there goes. But tell us a little bit about, as far as fishing the canal goes, when you're, like, going to the canal, what are you looking for when you're going to make a trip to the canal?
Well, first thing I want to look for is probably the cycle of the moon, and I really want to hit the canal on a full moon or a new moon, just because the tides are stronger. Looking at water temperature and getting reports about, are the mackerel in, where the mackerel been. In the end, there's no guarantee that they're going to come into the canal, but when those mackerel do come in, they have schools of big bass that follow them, and the bass are just voracious, and they will feed. And I've been there many more times and gotten skunked than I have caught fish. And I've gotten there numerous times where, you start talking to guys and, oh, you should have been here yesterday, or last night, and they were hitting everything 5 feet from me. But when it's slow, you'll find the guys that fish the canal all the time, they'll start jigging when nothing's showing on the surface. And a lot of fish come out of the canal, on jigs. My absolute least favorite way to fish whatsoever.
Oh, me too.
But that's just me. Some guys love it.
Yeah. I think, honestly, like, I've talked to guys, and some guys are like, if you're not fishing topwater, you're cheating, unless you're fishing at night, in which case you can fish, like, any water column. They're like, if you don't fish topwater during the day, you're cheating. And I've seen guys that are, like, religious, like, jigging with huge, like, whatever they, like, big soft plastics and stuff. And, all the power to you if you want to sit at the canal and, be jigging with a giant, 12-foot rod, throwing 10-ounce jigs out there and completely destroying your arms and back. But yeah, to me, I just think it's so much more fun to be throwing, a pencil. Like, oh my gosh, to see because the canal is so calm, and when a big fish blows up on top water, it's crazy to see. I've been there once or twice where it's been like crazy fishing, but I've been there a lot. To your point, I have one story that I've told a few times where I went to the canal. It was on a new moon, and there was not really that much going on. There's a little bit of squid in the canal, and there's a few like schoolie sized fish just like blitzing on the squid. I fished all day at the canal and didn't catch anything, and I came home, and this was actually after we started working, and I think I was fishing with a shad stick, and I go out there, and first cast I hooked a 45-inch bass because it was like the perfect tide. So I drove home, and I was like, it's the perfect tide, I can't not go out and fish. First cast, hooked a 45-inch bass. So I always tell that story. It's like a lot of people love the canal. It might just be me not knowing a lot about the canal, but like I just think, I it's so awesome to get on those like crazy bites at the canal. But in the past year, I think it's, at least last year, it was not as good as it was the year before, for sure. I mean,
2 years ago was phenomenal. Last year was not as good. Canal for me becomes more of a social thing. I start seeing people that I've met and get to talk to them, and so it's more of a social gig than needing to go catch fish. You see a variety of people. When it's hot and heavy, it actually, to me, isn't really worth it anymore.
it's like shooting a fish in a barrel.
Well, I mean, and then, and people become so obsessed with it, all manner of politeness can go out the window with some individuals. But, the canal's so much different because when that tide moves through there, it is ripping. And it's a lot of water moving through, and it's like fishing a giant river. And it's a lot different than where you fish other places, just because the volume of water is funneled through there like that. I had more fun in September this year than I did in the summer, because you had albacore in there and you had bonito, and they were blitzing up and down the canal, and there was less people, and it was, September's just such a beautiful month. Low humidity and blue skies, and had a ball.
Mm-hmm. And that's the thing about the canal is that like there's so many people that fish there, and so really if you're not going there to want to be like social, there's no real point in going there. I mean, unless you want to just get into these epic blitzes, which is one thing, which is super cool, but you have to want to be fishing in a crowd, and a lot of people don't enjoy fishing in crowds. But and it's a very I guess it's just depends on the person, I guess, when it comes to fishing. Some people like to use fishing as a whole social thing, and others like to be fishing and use it as a way to get away from people and fish by themselves. So I guess it really depends on the person and like how they like to fish.
Yeah, I think looking back over the years, my most memorable fishing experience have usually been by myself or with one other person. I had a lot of good trips to the Outer Cape, but that has really kind of ended. Fishing along the beaches of Nauset and up through there, and then South Beach and Monomoy Island. Those places used to hold tremendous fish, and even Monomoy still does in the rips right off of Monomoy, but a little bit harder to get from the beach. But now you just get some schoolies. Pretty tough to get quality fish over there.
Mm-hmm. What's your if you had to pick like one structure to fish, what would your favorite structure to be to fish?
One.
Want to fish like rips, like go on a sandy beach, or go fish like in a boulder field with big surf, or in the back bays and estuaries?
No, back bays and estuaries don't really excite me. Giant surf doesn't really excite me. I like moving water. And if I had my preference, I think it would be a rip over a boulder field. Rip over a sandbar would be next, but moving water around a point where the point comes out and it continues to be rocky. I mean, that's just magic. Those bass are hanging behind those rocks, waiting to just attack.
Yeah. And, and for me, my favorite structure to fish is when you get the wave sweep from like big surf, you get these waves crashing in, and where you have these bigger like boulders sticking out of the water, and it's like funneling the current in one way and out the other, and the bass are staged up like right deep down in the water. I find like casting to all this white water, and the reason I love the shad stick so much because it just dives underneath all of the super turbulent water. Being able to fish where I can get that thing under the water, underneath that turbulent water, and be right into the strike zone. And that's my favorite stuff to fish, that just big, heavy surf. And something that I'm trying to get way much better at is fishing, the sandy beaches and the rips and stuff, because, I have a broad knowledge of like fishing that area, but I want to be as confident as I am, fishing off the rocks as I am on a sandy beach, as I am in an estuary at the end of the day. And it's one of those things that estuaries aren't like, I know some guys that like love fishing estuaries. That's like all they do, and they pull huge fish. I mean, around here the estuaries are like everywhere, but they pull like really large fish in these small little like half the size, well, really small plugs, like the size of your small Magnum Walker and stuff. They're pulling like 45 inch 50-inch bass on that in these estuaries. It's insane. Which I don't even know how you find a bass like that in an estuary. That's crazy. Like, cause I see a lot of fish in that low 30 schoolie to like 35-inch range in the estuaries, but to be able to target like a bass that's 45 inches, it's pretty crazy.
That's a big fish. I got a new swimmer for you.
You do?
If I can get it out of it.
Ooh, it's a big one.
Yeah, that's. I think that's 7.5 ounces.
Oh, yeah. I'm gonna have to use my ODM Jig Star rod, my 10-ounce rod, to throw that.
It swims like a champ too. I tested it yesterday. It was great.
Oh man.
This one, I've got that new single hook on it. That's a 7/0 VMC single.
Yeah.
And that's actually that's a 5/0 hook on the belly, and it's too small. It needs to be bigger. It's 6X strong, but it needs to be
It's
bigger.
really crazy.
But that one, you could troll that behind a boat for tuna.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Oh, so I wanted to get into that too. So I know you create like the tuna bomb. It's something one of my like, bucket list things to do is to go sight casting for the bluefin tuna. Is there any? Do you make any changes when you're creating a plug for a tuna than a striped bass?
Yeah, tuna plugs tend to be, a little more. There's no reason why you couldn't use this for bass, but tuna plugs tend to be a little bit brighter because tuna is a pelagic species, and you're moving out more. They target pelagic species as well, right? And so those types of fish tend to be a little more colorful, the bait fish and everything. So you can get away with something like that. For tuna. So color, I don't know too much about action. I mean, there's plenty of plugs out there that would work. And depends, you're not going to troll. You're talking about casting for tuna, right?
Yeah.
The other thing I would probably do is, my hardware. So I've got something new coming out. So most of my all of my plugs, except for the jointed ones, but all my other plugs are made with stainless steel through wire, right? I'm working on a new wire right now that I have access to that's twice as strong as that with the same diameter. So it's actually a titanium wire. It's a titanium alloy, which is completely saltwater corrosion resistant, but the wire itself's got a tensile test of like 400 pounds.
Yep. That's crazy.
That would be a little bit different.
Could definitely hold a nice size tuna.
Yeah. I mean, you're not going to break that wire. You're not going to break this wire in all reality unless you're using something that's 150 pound test wire, line or heavier.
Like, you'd have to be having 110 pounds of drag on your reel to like break that. Which, what reel are you going to be using that you can cast with? I mean, I think the biggest reel that you can cast with is what, the Daiwa Dogfight, probably, that huge. Yeah, I mean, that's probably the biggest reel, and that like only has, I think, 64 or 54 pounds. I think that's what it was. And so, like, that would be more than enough to hold for something like that, which is awesome. And I think the craziest thing about striped bass is you're fishing with gear for the striped bass that you can catch a tuna with. That's extraordinary. It just shows you how powerful these big fish can get, especially in current, like the canal, for example. I mean, when that's cooking and you hook like a 30-pound bass, it's going to feel like it's 50 pounds, the canal with all the current.
Yeah, and unlike tuna, there's usually structure around for bass. So they'll bring you down to the bottom, they'll wrap you around a rock or a pylon or something like that. Tuna, you just have to worry about other people's boats and anchors and your own prop. But yeah, I mean, I can't imagine casting this, but you could absolutely troll that.
Oh, I would cast that. Might chop my finger off in the process, but
7.5 ounces. Yeah, that wouldn't be a lot of fun for me, but that's it.
Just have to work out my shoulder a little bit before I get out there casting that thing. So we didn't actually end up going to the show because of the whole virus, the craziness of that going on, which is, I think that was definitely the right decision for them to cancel that. I mean, it's so crazy with all of this stuff going on. But you were going to come out with the new pencils. I was wondering if you wanted to talk about those now or if you wanted to save them for another time.
It's up to you. I did make them. I made them for the show. I showed one earlier. But yeah, I've got them. Uh-oh, that one is through the barb. I have to rip it. There we go. So yeah, I basically discontinued the Tinker and the Poombah pencil, and this will just become the Poombah pencil in 3 sizes. This is pretty small. I mean, this is like 2 ounces.
Yeah.
3 ounces, 4 ounces. 4 ounces about as big as I want to throw. That's a big pencil.
Yeah, so I was fortunate enough to have my hands on the small one at the end of the season, and I think I caught 6 bass over 35 inches on that plug, if my count is correct.
That's correct.
Crazy, and this is all in like mid to late October. I was killing it on that little pencil, and I immediately fell in love with it. And then I've been able to test out those other ones, and I've kept it quiet. I've been like blacking them out in my Instagram posts because I was waiting for after the show before I would start showing pictures of those plugs. But I'm so excited to be throwing the medium sized one and the big one for that matter, this next season, because like those plugs are they cast so far and they're so easy to work, and so I'm super excited to be throwing the bigger sizes because I guarantee there's gonna be some really nice fish caught on that this year, if not by me, by other people. Yeah, especially in,
This is nothing. I mean, guys throw this on the canal all the time.
Oh yeah.
Huge plugs like this.
Mm-hmm.
Consider that a huge plug. 4 ounces.
Oh yeah, definitely.
7.5, 7 3/4, or something like that.
Yeah.
It's got good weight to it. I like the shape. So we'll see. I'll do it in a bunch of colors. I did a new one for Florida in a mullet color, and guys have been catching tarpon and jack crevalle and black tip sharks and spinner sharks and.
That's crazy. I've seen a few videos of guys like what's that guy Snooker Die on Instagram, and that when he hooked into that tarpon, like it was off that pier or something. I was like I need to do that. That's insane.
That was off of Mac
so
Daddy.
crazy.
Yeah.
That was the Mac Daddy.
Yeah.
That's crazy. I mean, definitely something I need to go and do at some point is go fish for those Florida species that like the spinner sharks, the black tip sharks, tarpon, if possible. Tarpon are so cool. Definitely a crazy fish to catch.
Yeah, I learned a lot this year down there. I learned a lot about the mullet run, and it was pretty interesting. I don't know if it's still going on right now, but
Yeah, I have no idea.
No idea.
that's a big fish.
But that's
Those big tarpon are big.
I mean, we were in Florida a while ago and feeding we're on our charter boat, and like after they filleted up the fish, we were able to feed these like enormous 150-pound tarpon that were just like goldfish under the dock, and being able to like reach down and like dangle a piece of like meat and have this huge fish just come up and just like eat it out of your hand. I was like, oh my god, that was the most incredible. Like, they're huge. Tarpon are like they're enormous fish. It would be insane to hook one of those on like spinning gear and see that go off. And guys fly fish for that.
fly fish for that too.
Oh
I
yeah.
mean,
Crazy. Like, yeah, what are they using? 14 weight rods?
rods.
10 weight, 12 weight.
Crazy. And so when you were fishing for, like, if you had to pick one fly setup, like rod, reel, line, what would you pick for striped bass fishing?
Bass fishing.
For striped bass fishing, I would. Well, first of all, I'd have a 9-foot 9-weight with a matching reel. It would probably be a large arbor reel, so you've got more line pickup with every turn of the handle. I have a good drag system. I'd have not that you need it, but I'd have probably gel spun backing on there. Typical fly line. I really like the intermediate clear tip that Orvis used to sell. They still might sell it, but basically I think it's the front 20 or 30 feet. It's like all of monofilament clear, and it's very slow sinking. You can fish poppers on top water if you had to with it. But I like it because it's clear and it gets down underneath a little bit. Probably a 15-pound test tippet, and who knows for flies, but either a variation of a deceiver or a clouser, one of those two flies. Probably a deceiver, and it would be all white.
Yeah. And, you know, as a spinning guy and somebody that always preaches throwing as heavy gear as you can get away with, when you're fishing like 15-pound tippet, I'm sure you're catching huge, 35, 40-inch bass on the 15-pound tippet, no problem. But is it, like, would you bring 15-pound tippet into structure? So if you're fishing...
No.
I guess
you would not...
bring that.
No.
Yeah.
If we were fishing 15-pound tippet where you and I were fishing, you wouldn't have a hope of landing a bass. You'd have your hands full with 20-pound tests. Most people don't put 20 pounds of test, 20 pound of pull on a fly rod. Most people get lucky to put 4 or 5.
Wow. Yeah. We're definitely 100% next season. Next time you come, you got to bring your fly rod, and we should just go there and see if we can pull a bass out of that spot one night.
Um,
See what happens.
We can do it if he's a schooler.
Yeah, I know. We're gonna lose either a lot of like fly line or like in flies, but it would be pretty fun to see if we could actually pull a bass out of there. Because when I fish, like, because I know nothing about fly fishing, so when I was fishing in that area, I would just take straight. I believe it was probably like 30-pound, just straight. I think it was tippet, and I would just tie it right to the fly line, and just like have
That worked.
4 feet of like 30-pound test, like tippet, and I was throwing it in there, and I still got broken off a whole bunch of times, but I mean, it's pretty crazy. I mean, it's hard to pull a bass out of that spot on spinning gear, especially if they're big, because all it takes is that bass to just go right into the rocks, and it just cuts you off clean every time. Definitely lost a lot of plugs last year to some fish cut me off in the rocks. That's why I go heavy.
That's the challenge of that spot, right?
Yeah. I mean, that's why, when I fish there, I don't mess around, and I'm putting as much drag as possible on the fish, and I'm trying to fight that fish super hard from the start, trying to get it up and out of the rocks. I do that, regardless if because it's so scary, because what happens is you hook into the fish and it comes up, because it's not that deep. It's probably 8 feet deep there, maybe a little bit more, but what happens is the fish, if it's big, it's going to rise up to that surface, and then it's going to thrash around on the surface for a second and just take off, and if you can get it up and like keep it up on the surface as long as you can, I mean, that's what I found in that spot. It's all you can do, and then you just, because it's inevitable that the fish is going to take off on that first big run, because you can't stop it. It's so powerful, and so the bass takes off, and hopefully you can get it up and out of the structure for long enough that when it took off, it doesn't get you into a rock. And the other thing that was happening, I remember that night, or at least one of the nights, is we were fishing with the Danny plugs, and they were getting hit out of the water because the bass were all competing to whack them. Remember that? I mean, the bass were launching those plugs out of the water. It's pretty crazy.
Yeah, I find bass hit a Danny plug pretty aggressively no matter what. And I don't know if it's just because it's mimics a wounded bait fish so well, and it's just that slow. But yeah, when they hit a Danny, I've never had them sip a Danny.
No, yeah. There's, like, I mean, because if you think about it, like, when you're like live lining bunker, if you don't have any weight on it and you hook it through the nose, it's going to go up sideways on the surface, and what it does is it kind of like flutters across the surface and then like turns over and darts on the other direction. And when I saw that for the first time, I was like, wow, that looks so much like a spook, like a Magnum Walker. It does that same, like, flutters up to the surface and then kind of darts from either side, because it's like when it's getting like attacked from below, that's what the bunker will do when they're injured. They kind of like try to get up to the surface, and then they kind of like dart when they're right about to be hit. So I think that's why something like the Danny plugs or Magnum Walkers work so well, because they mimic that injured bait fish right up on the surface, like just darting off to the side. Yeah, and the bass are just, I mean, quite clearly, we that night they're keyed in on bunker, and we definitely had some aggressive fish in there. It was pretty crazy.
Yeah, I think it's got a lot to do with, again, freshwater or saltwater. The stop and go motion really triggers a lot of fish. So either, chugging along on the surface, but like a popper, pops and then it stops. Yep. And or the walker where it just goes to the side and then it slows for a bit. And then when you jerk it again, that elicits a heavy strike sometime. And I don't know what it is, but it's like maybe just it's so slow and a fish is looking, and then it moves again and it triggers like the adrenaline or something in the fish.
Yeah.
and he's just got to go after it.
I remember you talking about how you would fish where you live. You fish with the small Magnum walkers for smallmouth bass, and did you fish for pike or something with them as well?
Oh yeah, we get a lot of pike. Yeah, well, I live on Lake Champlain, so we have a ton of pike. We have a lot of back shallow bays, and that little walker, I'll catch smallmouth bass and pike all the time on them.
That's crazy. You probably get some monster pike, because that's not a small. I mean, it's not like that big, but I feel like that's not that small for a plug. I mean, it's probably, how long is the small Magnum walker?
It's only 6 inches.
6 inches.
6 inches.
I mean, a small
Yeah.
pike is 24 inches, so that's a little snack for a pike.
What's the biggest pike you've got on the Magnum walker?
Oh, I don't know. I don't know. Maybe in the 30s.
Pretty crazy. Yeah, I mean, I do hardly any freshwater fishing, and when I do freshwater fish, I'm like fishing for like panfish or like maybe some small trout on the fly rod and stuff.
But
I've got 20-inch smallmouth on that plug.
Oh yeah, I need to go. I mean, something to do in the winter. I mean, I'm sure that the smallmouth bass I know we have smallmouth bass and tons of pike around here. Should definitely try to go out and fish the little Magnum walker and see if I can get something on that.
Yeah, if you have open water.
It would be interesting to see if see because I haven't really fished with many plugs for like other species than like saltwater species, and fishing for striped bass is like the only thing I do, and it'd be pretty crazy to see another fish species go after a plug.
It's funny. That's all we use is artificials here on the lake.
Yeah, I mean, for sure. It would be pretty crazy. I have to do that. I'm just thinking now, thinking about what I could do. Yeah. So when you are fishing, and this is a like thing that I do a lot, is I fish with many different plugs and try to cover like water columns and stuff. Is there a specific when you start fishing, is there a specific plug that you start with? Do you love fishing covering water, or do you try to fish like small sections of water using like shad sticks or something?
Well, part of it is what's my former knowledge of the bait that might be in the area. So I'll fish plugs a lot from boats too. So if I'm fishing a rip from a boat and I know there's squid, I'm going to go to a squid right away, right? But otherwise, if I have absolutely no clue, and I'm not looking in the water and I'm not seeing any activity, and it's during the day, then I will typically go to a popper, because the popper that I make in particular is it's a sinking popper, and it casts a country mile. So I'm covering a lot of water, and I'm trying to elicit, an aggressive strike just to find fish around. So yellow and white popper is probably my go-to. If it's at night, it would be maybe a little bit different story. I'd probably use one of my gliders if it was at night, either like a black or a black and purple needle, something a little bit slower, something a little subsurface.
And that's pretty interesting, because like when I fish during the day, I'm huge into fishing. Start out covering water, either using like your Magnum walker or your pencil. And when I fish at night, what I like to do, I guess it's pretty similar, but I actually during the day I like to start from the top up or the top down, and then at night I go from covering water under like as close to the structure as I can with like the shad stick, and then I'll start moving up through the water column until I'm on the surface using Danny plugs and stuff like that. Definitely am.
Go ahead. I was just going to say sometimes depending on the structure. So if you're fishing ledges, and kind of drop offs, right? And waves are crashing into that. So it won't be so much water column as it'll be closeness to the ledge. So I'll go with a popper farther out where the water's calmer. But when the waves start breaking and it's next to the ledge and all that structure, then I'll go to the swimmer. And I'll work in close with a swimmer because I want to get beneath that white water and where they're sitting in ambush.
Yeah, and when you're fishing a rip, what would be your go-to plug in a rip?
Either a pencil or a popper.
Pencil or a popper, yeah. And then at night, are you throwing needle fish and rips or?
In a rip, but a tin's pretty effective too. But I don't make tins, but tins are pretty deadly.
Tins, bucktails, yeah. It was funny because I'll put up like polls on my Instagram, and I'll say, oh, I'm standing on the side of a rip. What plugs would you throw in here? And it's funny. A lot of people love bucktails. A lot of people love bottleneck swimmers. Yeah, I mean, and tins were another big one in rips off of sandy beaches.
Yeah, a lot of people throw darters.
Darters?
Yeah, when you have moving water like that, they'll throw a darter into a rip.
Yeah.
I personally love poppers. I love, the swing of the popper and make it pop and let it sit and it's just swinging through that rip and then when something hits that, man, that's just a ton of fun.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, the awesome thing with poppers is there's so many different types of poppers and there's so many different ways you can work them. I love those like chugging, as I call them chugging, because you can sweep your rod and make these huge splashes. And the bass still love that, and they'll come like, I've had bass go airborne hitting these plugs. I'm talking about jump like 3-4 feet out of the water, hitting like one of those just cupped plugs and just chugging them through the water. One of the before I really like got into fishing topwater plugs, I remember I was throwing Gibbs Polaris popper, and it was not a lot was going on, but I was chugging the popper, trying to make as big a splash as I could with the popper, and it was probably a 33-inch bass, like hit it and jump literally 4 feet out of the water, and hit it so aggressively. And I thought that was the coolest thing ever. I was hooked on throwing topwater plugs after that. That was like all I did for the rest of the year because, it was so awesome to see how aggressive these fish are, because it's one thing to like feel them hit under the water. It's another thing to visually see the bass and see how quick and how it just inhales like these plugs on the surface of the water. Yeah, it's pretty crazy to watch that. If you're fishing like a Magnum Walker, and this is the other thing that for me, when I'm fishing a Magnum Walker and I see a big fish starting to swirl on my Magnum Walker when I'm working it in, what do you do when you start seeing a big fish like waking and swirling on the back of your popper?
I usually lose hope, but a lot of times I'll just stop it and give it an extra long pause and then move it again. But usually that I've found when a fish swirls like that, he's come so close, and at the last second he's changed his mind, and that's going to be real hard to get that fish to come back. So a lot of times I'll rest that spot because the fish probably hasn't moved. He's hanging on some sort of structure, and I'll fish somewhere else, and then I'll change to a different style of plug, like a different color, maybe go subsurface, something different shape, something different size, just so it's a different, because he didn't like something about that. Now, there's no hard and fast rule. You could cast right back out there, and he might hit it the second time. For sure. But, so I might give it one more cast, and if I don't see any activity, I'll fish somewhere else, then I'll switch it up, total different color, shape, action, and try that.
Because, I've fished a lot, especially with your Magnum Walker. There's one time in particular, it was kind of in the same area that we were fishing, and kind of the same scenario where you had that group of boulders or that one big rock just sticking out of the water for a long like stretch, and I was working the Magnum Walker right along the side of that, and immediately as soon as the plug hit the water, there's a bass, like I could see its tail wake following it. It looked like somebody's oar was behind my plug. It was huge, and it followed it for probably 10 feet before it hit the plug. And what happened is I was working it so close to the rock, and the water was really calm at that day, but I was working it so close to the rock that when it hit the plug, it actually hit the plug out of the water and onto the rock. And it got stuck on the rock, and I had to rip it off there, and I had seaweed on it, and the fish didn't come back. But I thought it was pretty interesting because the fish followed that plug for so long beside that rock, and then he actually decided to commit to hit the plug, and unfortunately it didn't get hooked. Maybe it didn't really commit, but I've had other times in estuaries where you'll be working a plug like a small Magnum Walker or a little small popper, and you'll have the bass swirling on you for a while. You can see it, and then it will just eat the plug. So I thought it would be interesting because, you know, so many people have different views on that. Like when a fish is swirling on it and not hitting it, oh, you should switch to a popper that's like that, but it's like a different color or maybe a different size. Yeah, and to your point, I mean, you said switching it up, you know, not fishing there for a little bit, letting that fish settle, and then casting back in there and seeing if it goes after it again.
Yeah, and you know, some of that always remains a mystery to me. I mean, we don't really know what's going on sometimes. So when you see, you know, you say a bass is following it, so you see different types of swirls, right? It could be that, you know, it might be a school of fish, and those are different fish swirling, and then the one that hits the plug is actually the one that decides to commit. Other times it may be, you know, the same fish all the way in, and I've had fish hit my plug 6 different times until I finally hooked it. And again, I'm assuming it's the one fish, but it could have been a school. But usually when they start blowing the plug up, you know, it's usually the same fish. But what happens under the water is a mystery, and it sometimes it's that's the thing that keeps me coming back. You know, trying to figure it out.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like once you lose a really big fish, it's always that you're like hooked after that. This thing happened to me when I hooked into a really large fish, and I got all the way up to the surface of the water. It was actually floating. It was probably 35 pounds. It was huge, like enormous fish. It was easily 45 to 48 inches. It was massive. And it was big waves, and I finally got this fish up after battling it for a long time, and then it got hit by a wave and it got washed under the water again, and it took off under the water on this run, and my rod hit the rock beside me and it snapped my line, and I lost the fish. And that was the first time I went from catching maybe 1 to 2 keepers a year to catching that, you know, hooking that. So for me that like got me so hooked on fishing. Was there a moment in your fishing that like you got hooked into fishing for striped bass, at least?
Well, I would say it was, again, going back to my years when I was fly fishing on the vineyard. We'd fish all night, we'd fish till dawn, and at dawn there would be these massive blitzes when the light first started to come up, and all the fish would turn on, and for as far as you could see in both directions down each along the beach, there was just fish feeding. And I just remember thinking, and it was at those times we actually couldn't hook anything. We were catching fish all night, but there was so much bait going on, and I think it was probably the first time I ever really witnessed that. And then I would just live for that. Every morning I would live to see that blitz. I could never get enough of that. And there were times that I've seen striped bass come in so shallow on the sand that they had to turn sideways and flop to get through the water column, because the water was only 4 to 6 inches deep, and they were feeding on sand
That's
eels.
crazy.
And I've seen them streak through sand eels, and as they went through them, the phosphorescence would light up, and it would be like a shooting star through the water. So you see things that are new on the ocean, and every time you go out. And so I don't know if it's so much that it's bass fishing, as much as it's I love being on the North Atlantic coast because of all the different things that you see. And
Yeah.
just happen to target striped bass and say bluefish, but it never gets old.
And yeah, I mean, that's something that, like, for me, I mean, I've witnessed some extraordinary things from, giant bass doing crazy things at night. Like, I remember I had one of your, I think it was a fatty glider, and I thought I had seaweed on it. So I started reeling it really fast across the surface of the water, and I had this big fish jump out of the water behind it 3 or 4 times. I stopped moving it, and then it just slammed it. And it was like easily a 30, like maybe 38, 39 inch bass, huge, like massive fish, but just leaping out of the water, to having seen, like a 7-foot, what was it? It's blanking on the name, sturgeon. I saw a 7-foot sturgeon once jump out of the water, 20 feet away from me. And that was like crazy.
Yeah, Atlantic sturgeon are pretty cool.
They're crazy, aren't they? They're so prehistoric looking.
Yeah, I think the freakiest thing I saw, I was pretty intensely fishing on the canal once, and there was a whale in the canal, and it just kind of came up right in front of me, and yeah, it just looked that much bigger because the area was that much smaller and confined. It wasn't like it was out on the open water. Yeah.
I've seen some two separate occasions. I've seen 2 great white sharks fishing. Once I was fishing off these rocks on this beach. It was actually raining that day, but and I see this fin like cutting through the water, and I'm like, wow, it's a shark. So then I climbed up high up onto the rocks and looked down, and it was probably a maybe 12, 13 foot great white, just cutting right across the surface. And then I actually have a video of it, and I quickly whipped out my phone. I was like, nobody's gonna believe this. And there was a little bit of a glare on the water, so you couldn't see like the fish under the water, but you could see its fin going across the surface, and it was going right down towards the beach where all these people were like, not that there was a lot of people swimming, there's like 1 or 2 because it was like in between raining, and I was like, wow, that's pretty crazy. There's great white sharks. I've also seen, as far as the canal goes, I was fishing the canal, and I saw there was a great white shark, big, like huge, like its fin was probably like at least a foot out of the water, and it came up kind of in front of us, and you could hear everybody just start freaking out all the way down the canal because it was kept going like down, and everybody was screaming and pointing. It was hilarious, but it's so crazy with these seals and great white sharks now. I mean, that's like, it's only a matter of time before somebody like, catches a bass and has one eaten, from the canal or something. I mean, that's crazy. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, that's the crazy part about fishing, is that you get to witness some extraordinary stuff. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean,
Incredible stuff on the sea.
yeah.
Yeah, the lake is pretty mundane compared to what you see.
Well, we've been going for almost 2 hours now.
2 hours now.
Really?
It's an hour and 46 minutes.
Snowing like hell out. I can't wait for spring to hit.
Yeah, I've been I'm following. You see the maps that the On the Water magazine puts out? Have you
The
Have you
migration,
seen their map?
has it started?
put out their first one a few days ago?
And where are they? Just coming out of the Chesapeake, or?
Yeah, they're just coming out of the Chesapeake. I think that there's some just coming out of the Hudson. I saw some off of Sandy Hook, New Jersey. Unfortunately, I'm not going to be going down this year because of or up, down, because of the the coronavirus and everything. Probably not good to be traveling in hotels and stuff. But I definitely going to go to the Cape when they show up on the Cape.
Yeah, for sure. Well, that's why I just rig up the back of my truck and I can sleep in my truck and I don't have to go to a hotel or anything.
I know. That's what. Yeah. This definitely. That's pretty cool. Is there anything specific when you like? Because a lot of people like this is something that like a lot of people do. Is there anything that you do in the back of your truck as far as like for sleeping? Do you have like a mattress back there, or what?
Oh yeah, I've got a Coleman blow-up mattress that fits right between the wheel wells, and it takes up the whole back of the truck, and I just blow that up and put in pillows and sleeping bags, and I had some great nights this summer.
That's awesome. That's so cool.
One night where I had the cops stop by and ask me if everything was okay, and I kind of parked where I shouldn't have parked, I guess, but there was one night in Rhode Island where I was sleeping. I was able to camp out there, but it was right on the water. And about 4 a.m, I had quit fishing. I had a great night of fishing. And about 4 a.m, I hear this dragging and scraping, and these guys were hauling their kayaks up the rocks to get back to their car. And they didn't know I was sleeping, so they were making all kinds of noise, but they had been out in wetsuits and kayaks out in the ocean fishing all night.
Wow.
For bass.
Wow. That's crazy.
That was pretty gutsy. I mean, yeah.
Well, kayak fishermen are crazy.
Hardcore. Yeah.
That's gotta be so freaky, because I mean, you gotta get pretty disoriented being out there just in the pitch black. There's nothing to really gauge yourself of where you are. That's pretty crazy, kayaking out there. And I don't know if I would do that.
They had done this before. You could tell that they were kind of pretty comfortable. Yeah. But yeah, that's hardcore.
That's pretty crazy. I'm so excited for spring. When are you planning on like getting your first bass this spring?
Early May.
Early May.
Yeah.
Wow. Pretty much May we're gonna get them here.
Yeah. So maybe the end of this month, along the Cape, the Southern Cape, but I don't think it'll be till early part of May.
Mm-hmm. So I mean, I've been I've been following them, and I think they're 5 days ahead of last year. Apparently, the migration. That's what they said on that map. They said they're 5 days ahead of last year, which is crazy because the year before that, they were 10 days ahead of that year, or something crazy like that. So the bass, I mean, it's crazy to see. I mean, with such a warm winter, at least this year, I mean, the bass are starting early.
Yeah, I mean, you could say global warming or whatever, but I think they'll differ depending on water temperature within. They pay attention to the length of day, but they'll one side or the other length of day. I think water temperature has a big influence on that. So.
Yeah, I mean, they should be definitely showing up. I would assume probably early to mid April on the Cape. I'd have to believe. I mean, they're already in New Jersey, so or like mid I guess they're in northern New Jersey because I saw them the map. I guess they're coming out of the Hudson, so they're kind of around like Sandy Hook, in that area. So yeah, I would say probably by early mid April they'll be on the Southern Cape, or at least close to maybe Rhode Island.
I got to get down to the Hudson. That's only a few hours from me, so I'll see what's going on down there, and
I've heard it's been lights out. Yeah, I've heard it's been like crazy. Like there's like people have been getting tons of action by nothing big, but like schoolie to like 30-inch size fish, but catching a lot of them. There's just been a lot of fish. So yeah, and this is early. It's still March, and they're still doing very well, which is crazy to see.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Well,
Thanks for
thank you
having
so
me,
much
Finn.
Yeah,
This was awesome. Thank you for coming on. It was a lot of fun.
fun.
I appreciate all your support, and wish you all the best of luck with your podcast. Seems to be going well.
Yeah. I think people will love this one. This is a special podcast. Well, again, thank you so much for coming on the podcast, and thank you guys for watching the podcast. I hope everybody enjoyed this podcast, and I'll see you next time.